I am hosting the spirit of Guangong. You're not hosting Guangong. I'm hosting Guangong. And so, so shut up or I'm going to cut your heads off. Greetings! I'm Aaron Balave, and this is me trying Guandao, secretly transmitted methods of the Guandao. This is my series for talking about all things Guandao. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Guan Yu. So, if you haven't watched my video on exorcist spirits and divine generals, I recommend watching that first. So I'll put a link in the down below. I think there's going to be some content in that video that'll be relevant for this. So, from a modern perspective, we might look at the figure of Guan Yu from three different perspectives. So, from a historical perspective, Guan Yu was a person, according to the historical record, an actual person. Guan Yu was also a very famous literary character, was and still is. And Guan Yu was also worshipped as a deity for probably about 1,000 years in China. A very important deity, particularly in North China. And when we're talking about Guan Yu, the figure, Guan Yu, and the Guandao, I think there's a tendency to overemphasize the historical person and the literary character without giving enough attention to Guangong, Lord Guan, the god, Lord Guan. And I think that Lord Guan is actually the most relevant aspect of this figure when we're talking about the Guandao. Now, quick caveat, pre-modern people probably wouldn't have separated the figure of Guan Yu into a historical person, a literary character, and a god. I think to a large extent people would have seen these three different aspects as the same entity. Because of course they had different concepts of religion and history and literature. But I'm a modern person in the modern world. You, dear viewer, are probably also a modern person in the modern world unless you have some kind of time travel mechanism or something. So I think it'll be easier for us to look at this figure from these different ways. That's why I'm doing it. So the historical Guan Yu was a person born in Xia Prefecture, so present-day Shanxi. But he is actually mostly famous for his military exploits. He was a warrior and a general in Shuhan, in modern-day Sichuan. So pretty far away from his home. And that's where kind of most of his famous exploits took place. I'm not going to go into detail on the biography of Guan Yu. It's pretty easy to find information if you're interested. But when we're talking about the historical person Guan Yu and the Guandao, I think all over the internet, especially the Chinese internet, the first thing everyone loves to point out is that the historical person Guan Yu almost certainly never used a Guandao. And we know that this is true because Guandao probably didn't exist at that time. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that they did exist. In fact, they probably didn't appear until about 1,000 years later. So there is no reason to assume that the historical person Guan Yu used a Guandao. And so if you didn't know that, that is a very important takeaway. But when I see this factoid released on the internet, I think that there is either an implication or sometimes a direct statement of the idea that the reason we associate the Guandao with Guan Yu is because of the novel Yi, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So if you've heard about Guan Yu before, you've probably seen him in video games or TV shows or movies. And these TV shows, movies, video games, etc., 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 are based off of Yi, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a Ming Dynasty novel, somewhat based off of the historical record of Guan Yu and other people from that time period. It wasn't as if the Romance of the Three Kingdoms was the first time the story was told, but it was in the Ming Dynasty at which this story became very, very, very popular, like it is today. Prior to that, there were other historical war epics that were more popular, like the kind of the cycle of the Qin and the Han, the Qin, the Han. So it was only during the Ming that the Romance of the Three Kingdoms stories became kind of the most popular go-to historical war epics. But by the beginning of the Ming, before all of those stories became super, super, super popular, the iconography associated with Guan Yu was already firmly in place. So Guan Yu is often depicted, he has a very large triangular beard, he's kind of a grizzled, tough-looking guy, he usually has green robes, sometimes he has like a red face, and he rides a very sturdy horse. He's usually accompanied by a couple of attendants who carry his armor and his weapons when he's not using them. And then, of course, he's wielding his Qinglong Yan Yue Dao, his Guandao. So this imagery that's associated with the character Guan Yu is already very well established by the time the story Sanguo Yanyi is becoming popular. How does that happen? Well, a lot of this iconography starts appearing in the Song dynasty. At the same time, people are starting to worship Guan Yu. We're starting to see cults to Guan Yu. And when I say the word cult, I don't mean the 1970s drink the Kool-Aid, like, hippy-dippy kind of cult. I'm using this in the term of a smaller, usually localized religion. So why did people start worshipping Guan Yu? How did this cult start to spread? And how did it spread all over China by the Ming? Don't know. It's impossible to say for sure. There is a wonderful academic book that I highly recommend that is where I get most of my information on Guan Yu, or at least the foundation on Guangong, Guan Yu as a deity. So that is the book by Baron Terhar called Guan Yu, The Religious Afterlife of a Failed Hero. I highly recommend you check that out. And in this book, Terhar makes the case that the cult of... He investigates records of shrines and temples and kind of other physical evidence of worship to Guan Yu to kind of create a map. See how it begins in the Song and expands greatly and then continues through the Yuan and into the Ming and into the Qing. And to look at when these temples are first established, when they are fixed up or repaired, and to understand how the cult went from place to place. And he makes the case that the cult was transmitted through oral storytelling, through mouth to mouth. So, and part of the reasoning of this is that it doesn't follow along the lines of published literary works. It doesn't follow along the lines of written word. If it were something that were being transmitted through written word, we would see a path connected to major publishing centers and kind of, where the educated written information usually is transmitted. And it also doesn't follow along the lines of performance and, opera troupes and things like that. So if it were being spread through live performance, which many things were at the time, you would also expect to see that following the lines of where performers usually go and where the biggest establishments are. And the spread of the cult does not follow that. So he kind of presents this idea that it was probably, merchants, ritual specialists, people, kind of grassroots in a lot of ways. The people who were traveling for other reasons, and it was more, oral transmission, stories, blah, 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 blah. So what does the transmission of cults to Guangong look like? What kind of information is being passed on? What kind of stories are being told? Well, certainly in a later period, in the later periods in particular, the stories of Romance of the Three Kingdoms play a role. So stories about the life of the historical Guan Yu that are kind of become performances and narratives and other forms of literature. This certainly plays a role in the transmission of the cult. But when we're talking about the religious cult specifically, a lot of the stories that are being transmitted are actually about Guangong, about Guan Yu after the death of the historical person and what happens with his spirit afterwards. And we see tales that have a kind of a Taoist flavor or a Buddhist flavor, and certainly there are shrines to Guangong inside of Taoist temples, and he is a part of certain Taoist worship. And there are shrines to Guangong in Buddhist temples, and he is sometimes a part of Buddhist worship. And then there are temples to Guangong that are specifically for Guangong. And then there are also shrines to Guangong in temples of other gods. So he's worshipped in a lot of different contexts. And there are lots of different kinds of stories about the god. So I'll give you a few examples of stories about Guangong the god. So the first one, here's kind of an origin myth for Guangong. And there are multiple origin myths, but here's one of them that's maybe a little more popular than some of the others. So normally when a person dies in Imperial China, they receive sustenance from their descendants in the form of ancestor worship. So people will give offerings to the spirits of their ancestors, of their deceased ancestors. And this takes the form of, food or liquor or incense, giving them various kinds of offerings. And it's believed that these sacrificial offerings will provide sustenance to their spirits. And over time, these spirits just kind of gradually disperse. But unfortunately, there are some spirits that don't receive this kind of sustenance. And this often occurs with spirits that die violently. So it might be someone who commits suicide or who is murdered, or in the case of Guan Yu, someone who dies in battle is actually executed. He is captured and then beheaded by his enemy. And so in this case, his spirit is not going to receive ancestor worship. It's not going to receive the spiritual sustenance that it needs for his spirit to kind of go along the proper course. And this is a recipe for disaster, because when you have a powerful person like Guan Yu, whose spirit is not receiving sustenance, they can get into trouble. They might become an Egui, a hungry ghost who goes about trying to find sustenance in other ways and causes trouble. Or he might become a Guhun, an orphan spirit who similarly needs to find some kind of spiritual sustenance another way. And these are the kinds of spirits you really don't want running around, because they can cause a lot of problems, and they might find ways to gain sustenance through finding worshippers. And some of the ways they find these worshippers is by threatening people, by doing harm, so that people will give offerings out of fear. And so in this particular origin myth, this seems to be kind of the path that Guangong is going on. He is this kind of orphan spirit or hungry ghost that is kind of haunting or inhabiting the area around Jingzhou. And so in this myth, there's a monk who is going to this area to establish a temple or a pagoda. There's lots of different versions of the story, so the details tend to change. But so he is out there getting ready to start constructing his pagoda, and when he is visited by this terrible spirit who's riding a horse, and he has these general attendants with him, and he's carrying a giant Guandao. And of course, this is Guan Yu, and he's kind of coming, and he looks so terrible, and he introduces himself, and he talks about all the people he has killed, and how powerful he is. But the monk, either by saying something profound to him or just by his kind of outward appearance, is able to enlighten Guangong, is able to enlighten the spirit, or to kind of inspire him through the monk's own enlightenment. And sort of instantly, this orphan spirit, this hungry ghost, is now transformed, and he offers to help provide lumber for the construction of the pagoda, and he reforms the land so that it can be built properly. Or in some versions, he swears to become a protector of the people of the area. And so this basic formula, this story here follows the basic formula for an exorcist origin story that I outlined in my previous video. Here we have this kind of renegade spirit who is causing trouble, and until they end up meeting with an exorcist spirit who kind of pulls them back into line and brings them back into the spiritual hierarchy. Now, this particular story is a little bit different because it has some Buddhist flavor to it. So normally you would have a renegade spirit who is causing problems, and then an exorcist spirit would come and defeat them in battle. He would, fight them until they are brought back into the spiritual hierarchy. But in this case, it's Buddhist, so the monk is just very enlightened and kind of shows Guangong the light. And this particular origin story was so famous that it made it into Sanguoyeni, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is very important because, you know, I think particularly how Romance of the Three Kingdoms is read now, a lot of it is sort of, I think, often seen as almost a work of historical fiction, you know, kind of like a literary version of historical events. And this is one particular instance where we see some kind of a bit of a break into the spiritual realm, you know, whereas most of the novel is about the events of the mortal world. Here's kind of a peek into the world of gods. Of course, the version that made it into Romance of the Three Kingdoms has this additional part to it where, after being enlightened, the spirit of Guangong then goes on to possess the body of one of his enemies who caused his death, and then he kills that person. So it kind of breaks from the Buddhist vibe we have of earlier versions of the tales that don't have that event. But I think it makes for a better novel. But this is not the only origin story of Guan Yu. There are also stories that say that he was originally a dragon. And one of the roles of dragons is to provide rain. And so the idea was that the Jade Emperor discovered that he had been providing rain to people out of sympathy, rather than, you know, just doing it when he's supposed to do it. And so the Jade Emperor was very upset with this and decided to punish him and, you know, force him to become immortal. Excuse me, not immortal. Another kind of popular type story that's circulating with the cults of Guan Yu is the exorcism of a dragon or other being at in Xia Prefecture, where the god Guan Yu, where the person Guan Yu is from. And so the basic outline of this story is that there is a dragon who is causing problems in these salt ponds. Now, salt is an important commodity at the time. This is in the Song Dynasty. This is, you know, something you use for preserving food. And so if there's a problem with your salt production, that could become a very big issue. And so they send the imperial court sends an exorcist to go and solve this problem and get rid of this dragon who is causing problems. So he finds out what gods are available to him in Xia Prefecture, and discovers the Guangong. And so he writes a talisman and summons the god to deal with the dragon, which he does readily. And then later the god is summoned to the emperor, even though they tell him that he's a very terrifying god and the emperor should not, you know, doesn't need to be face to face. But the emperor's like, no, I want to see him. I want to meet him. And so he appears with the dragon's head on his hand, you know, it's his severed head, and says, you know, and introduces himself, tells him who he is, and, you know, what a badass he is, and basically says, give me title or else, to the emperor. And so the emperor's like, yeah, okay, you can, you know, you're a god, but we'll use you again. You do good work. So those are some of the kinds of stories that are being circulated. And very early on, we start to see some of the important iconography. In particular, there are accounts of some soldiers from the north who are traveling in the south, and they happen upon a temple to Guangong, and they see him possessing a weapon, and the text refers to it as, I forget the full term, but it's like a saw, or a saw-bladed dao, or a saw-toothed dao. So, you know, that could have been referring to a Guandao, you know, maybe the sawtooth was referring to the spikes in the back. It could have also been referring to another weapon. But then there are also visual representations of Guan Yu at this time. So there's this kind of fancy, important painting from the Song, and we see a pretty well-developed Guandao in this. You know, it's maybe not exactly the same shape as later, but we see all the important parts. We see the crescent-shaped blade, the hook on the back, and it's a big pole arm with a very big spike at the bottom. So the basic shape is already in place in the context of Guangong, Lord Guan, in the Song. So why were people forming cults to Guangong? What did they want from him? What did he do? Well, he did lots of things, and as time went on, in some contexts, he became a god of wealth, or he was famous for reading the Spring and Autumn Annals and all this different stuff. But especially in the beginning, his duties primarily center around two things. One is rain production, and one is righteous violence, is fighting things for good reasons. Rain production is kind of this aspect of the god that has to do with his association with dragons. So as I said before, there are stories where he himself was a dragon, and dragons control the rain, so, you know, a dragon is a good person to talk to if you want rain. But then there are also plenty of stories where he threatens dragons who are withholding rain, or he kills dragons who might be messing with the rain. So rain production is one of the things that kind of falls under the hoods of things that he can do. So another important aspect is Guan Yu as a protector spirit. He can be summoned when there are monsters about that are causing problems. And if you remember my previous video on exorcist spirits, at this time, evil spirits can be the cause of many problems. So, you know, violence can often be the answer. If someone is sick, that might mean that they are that they have been visited by disease-causing monsters, or that, you know, there is a fox spirit who is possessing them and causing a bunch of problems with their life and causing them to be sick. So you can have Taoist priests come over and perform thunder magic and have Guan Yu come and destroy the spirit or drive them away. And then, of course, Guan Yu can also be summoned if you need to fight actual people too. So he can be summoned to bolster an army. We can summon him to help us fight against, you know, a local warlord or bandits or whoever are coming to fight us. Now, on the other hand, the bandits may also be worshipping Guan Yu and may also be summoning him to give them strength or drawing protection from him. You know, perspective is kind of a powerful thing. And Guan Yu is someone who is strong and fights well. And if you're going to be in combat, you want him on your side. And so people can also act as mediums and summon Guan Yu into their bodies, and can also, you know, summon his divine soldiers into their bodies to help them fight in combat. So there are lots of records and lots of evidence to show how actors, performers, would summon the spirit into their body when performing the role of Guan Yu. And so when they're in this form, they can have very powerful ritual functions, and including driving off spirits. So in a pre-modern context, the performance of roles often serves a ritual function. So in addition to having priests kind of perform rituals, actors are often involved in either performing for the gods themselves, or performing other ritual functions of driving away spirits. And the best evidence I've found of soldiers acting as mediums for Guan Yu or for his divine soldiers actually comes from the Boxer Rebellion probably isn't a great term, for the Boxer incident of the very end of the 19th century, or the year 1900. So the Boxers are, you know, it's this kind of very grassroots farmers in Shandong and in like kind of northern China who decide that the problems of the dynasty can be attributed to foreign influence. So they go about attacking people who they perceive as helping foreigners, and they try to, you know, fight foreigners as well as much as they can. The Boxers practice a lot of spiritual possession, and they practiced it on a grand scale, so that they would have like hundreds of soldiers summon spirits into their bodies to go fight with them. And Guangong was probably was one of the most popular spirits, maybe the most popular. And so there's a great academic book, History in Three Keys. I'll put information down below. And there's an anecdote in there where that the author points out in which there are these two boxers who get into a very heated argument. And one of them says, "I am hosting the spirit of Guangong." And the other one says, "No, you're not. I'm hosting the spirit of Guangong." And they go back and forth, and neither one of them will back down, and things are getting too heated. So then one of their superiors comes over and says, "You're not hosting Guangong. I'm hosting Guangong." And so, you know, so shut up or I'm going to cut your heads off. And so then there's, you know, no more dispute after that. So what does all this matter to practitioners of Guandao today? Why do we need to know about Guandao, or do we need to know about Guangong at all? And why does it matter that it's the god and not the person and not the literary figure? To kind of simply state things, I think it's really important to know that worship of Guan Yu had spread all over China by the Ming, and it started spreading in the Song to the Ming. So the same time at which Guandao appeared and started to spread throughout the empire. And so by the time Guandao are being used in later periods, the association with Guan Yu is already complete. This is the weapon of Guan Yu. It's not the weapon of other spirits, with maybe one or two very small exceptions. And there are very few other weapons that are used in combat that are so closely associated with a particular spirit. So everyone knows who he is and what he does and what he's about. And by the time a young soldier is old enough to pick up a Guandao for whatever reason, the surrounding myths of Guangong, all of the culture related to him, all of the beliefs are already inside that person. You know, they remember seeing the opera performances of Three Kingdoms plays. They remember hearing the tales of Guangong being a badass and chopping the head off of a dragon. They remember seeing puppet shows that show those very things of him fighting various monsters and spirits. They remember the time their cousin was possessed by a fox spirit and they had to summon a Taoist exorcist to come and then summon the spirit of write a charm to summon the spirit of Guangong to fight away that fox spirit. They remember, you know, their uncles performing the role for important ceremonies before going out to battle. So, you know, all of these images are inside that person when they first hold that Guandao. And I think that when you're reading the martial texts, the martial treatises, even though Guan Yu isn't always explicitly mentioned, even though he often is, this was a cultural understanding. People knew what this weapon was about. They knew all this information. And when you're reading those texts, I think that having that context gives you a much better understanding of the material. So that's all I have for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please, you know, feel free to give me a like and a subscribe. I always appreciate it. I have a couple more videos before the series is complete, and I'll get back to it. So see you next time on Me Trying Guandao Fa, Secretly Transmitted Methods of the Guandao.